Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Reopening Schools, Why District Leaders Should Prioritize Mental Health in Their Plans. Before we get into today's presentation, I have just a few housekeeping items to run through. Today's webinar will be recorded, and a copy along with the slides will be sent out to all registrants at the conclusion of the presentation. Attendees are in listen-only mode. However, if you'd like to chat with us or ask a question, we encourage you to do so on the right-hand side of your screen in the GoToWebinar control panel. And if you're on social media, we invite you to connect with us by tweeting @Cognito or using the hashtag CognitoWebinars to continue the conversation online. Finally, I'd now like to turn things over to today's moderator, Jennifer Spiegler, to get us started. Take it away, Jennifer.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks everybody on the call for taking time to join us today. I'm Jennifer Spiegler. I lead the work at Cognito to help states and districts in supporting safe and caring school communities. And welcome again to today's session about why district leaders should prioritize mental health in their reopening plans. For those of you who don't already know Cognito, we combine the science of learning, the art of conversation, and the power of virtual human simulations to measurably improve social, emotional, and physical health. For PK-12 audiences, that means we strive to empower every member of the school community to be able to initiate those critical conversations that improve school climate, safety, and student well-being. Our immersive virtual learning experiences are designed for real-world impact. They've been proven to instill life-changing skills and self-confidence in adult and adolescent learners, and we scale. In the past decade, we've trained over 850,000 educators, impacting the lives of over 12 million students. Our growing portfolio of programs promote social-emotional competencies through the crucial topics of mental health, trauma, suicide prevention, and violence prevention and bullying. We're getting ready to launch a new series to promote violence prevention, and it features practice conversations that help build skills and self-confidence to lead more frequent and effective conversations in real life. One of the great perks of my work here is that it brings me into conversation with some of the smartest and most dedicated people in this country doing the work of supporting students and families. Today, I'm honored to bring you Dr. Margaret Coggins and Dr. Glenn Albright to talk about why we should be prioritizing mental health in district reopening plans. They will introduce themselves here briefly, but I will say that Dr. Albright is a co-founder of Cognito, and Dr. Coggins has recently provided her expertise to a new Cognito suite about violence prevention. So, Dr. Coggins, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Certainly. Good afternoon. Thank you, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's an honor and my pleasure to be invited by Cognito colleagues to participate in this event. By way of introduction, I am a psychologist by training. I have founded and run my own security consulting business, which I've been doing now since 2012. And prior to that, I was with federal law enforcement, and I was the head of the United States Secret Service Behavioral Research Program, which is the predecessor to the now National Threat Assessment Center. I spent over 20 years with the Secret Service doing research and supporting their protective mission. And my area of expertise for them and leading into my post-Fed career is prevention of targeted violence. So certainly have done a lot of work in that arena over the past now 30 years. In my consulting business, I work with schools, with government agencies, with corporate clients, all around the prevention of targeted violence. So I do insider threat, workplace violence prevention, school safety, school threat assessments, and threat assessment investigations. So it's my honor and pleasure to be with you here this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Glenn, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. First of all, can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. As Jennifer mentioned, Glenn Albright here. I'm a clinical psychologist, co-founder and director of research at Cognito, am former department chair and associate professor at Baruch College. And for those of you who haven't heard of Baruch, that's one of the senior colleges of the City University of New York. So my major function at Cognito is to lead a research team in examining the efficacy of the simulations, which allow us to really determine that they are evidence-based interventions that we do author and produce. So it's very happy to be with you and to talk to you today, and look forward to any questions that you may have.
Great, thank you. And I just will say to our listeners, this is just a half an hour, so it's going to be quick. We hope it's going to give you some things to think about and some actionable items to leave with. When we do leave the presentation, you will get a follow-up email that has some resources that Margaret and Glenn will probably mention in the course of our conversation. So you don't have to make yourself crazy trying to capture what they're sharing. But to kick us off, this has been, of course, an incredibly difficult year for schools and school districts, for parents, for teachers, for kids. But let's start, Glenn, with talking a little bit about the backdrop of where we think we are right now with the state of mental health and students, and give us a quick version of how adverse childhood experiences may have been heightened during the pandemic.
Well, that's a great place to start, Jennifer. And the statistics are rather eye-opening and quite sobering. If you look at pre-pandemic mental health stats, just kind of as a way of a baseline, 1/5 of the population has a diagnosable mental illness, with half of these illnesses beginning before the age of 14. Now, nationally, over 3,700 students in grades 9 through 12 attempt suicide each day. And that leads to about 2,000 suicides per year in grades 9 through 12. And it makes it the second leading cause of death in that group. And what's important to note is that 4 out of 5 teens who attempt suicide give clear warning signs that if you're looking for them, you can actually identify who they are. And what's really kind of sad is that the average delay for those who seek treatment for mental illness is 11 years before after the onset of symptoms. And in spite of the fact that early intervention is like most successful, this 11-year delay is really critically impacts their ability to develop a resiliency that they need to be successful. Now let's add the impact of the pandemic. 33% of parents report that their child is now experiencing, as a result of the pandemic, anxiety, depression, and thoughts of suicide. And that percentage increases if a family member or friend has contracted the virus, or a parent lost work, or if the child is in a toxic home environment. And we know the pandemic has increased the number of toxic home environments, which include an abusive family member, social isolation, alcohol abuse, poverty, food deprivation, all as a result of the pandemic. And lastly, if a child has pre-existing conditions for a mental illness, the pandemic acts as a trigger, bringing out that condition, if you will. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about adverse childhood experiences, or what we call ACEs, that have also increased as a result of the pandemic. Now, an ACE is a traumatic event that occurs before the age of 18. It's measured by a 10-item questionnaire where you answer either yes or no, such as, were you sexually or physically abused? And most horribly, that abuse usually begins in the first 5 years of life. Other questions addressed: did a parent or adult swear at you, insult you, put you down, humiliate you, or make you afraid that you would be physically hurt or hit so hard that it left marks? Or was there a parent in your household or other adults incarcerated, a problem drinker, divorced, mentally ill, or attempted suicide? ACEs are prevalent in our society. And statistically speaking, all of us here in this webinar have experienced at least one ACE. But many students and adults have experienced 4 or more ACEs. In fact, 16% of students experience 4 or more ACEs, which puts them at risk for substance use disorders, self-harm behaviors, depression, thoughts of a suicide, aggression towards others, including pushing, hitting, and biting in early childhood, and bullying, cruelty, and violence in adolescence. So if I have a student who is experiencing any of these, I always think, was there or is there a trauma background? And if there is a trauma background, it has to be addressed appropriately before the problem can be resolved. So that's, well, let me back up and say one last thing about ACEs. ACEs change the structure of the brain as you're developing. And students with 4 or more ACEs, because of that change in brain structure, experience problems in executive functioning, such as ability to reason, plan, problem solve, problems in memory, emotional regulation, concentration, social behavioral problems, all because the brain has been altered by these early childhood experiences, and they develop a lens to view the world through those relationships very early in their life. So that's, we anticipate a tsunami of student mental health concerns in the fall. We got to be prepared for them. We got to be able to promote social emotional learning and trauma-informed teaching. And we got to increase the availability of mental health support services, because 3%, that is only 3% of public schools, meet the recommended mental health clinician to student ratio. So there's some things that we can do in anticipating students coming back in the fall.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Glenn, I'm going to ask you to put yourself on mute, because I think we're getting some feedback from your phone or your computer. So thank you. And I want to take all of that information, which is so sobering, Margaret, and switch it over to you. And as somebody who has spent a lot of time thinking about troubled students and their potential for violence, and Glenn is talking about the tsunami of mental health issues, what does this mean for the potential for violence in schools as we come back and reopen? And how are you thinking about adverse childhood experiences and the exacerbation of traumatic issues during the pandemic?
Well, a number of thoughts. I mean, certainly I resonate with what Glenn just described to us, but I would like to maybe expand the discussion beyond the mental illness arena to talk about sort of the adverse impact on all of us, not necessarily adverse only childhood experiences, but the adverse impact on all of us that this past year pandemic has had. So obviously it's been a year of social isolation, of not having the kinds of contact that we're used to having with family and loved ones, with not being able to play with friends and hang out with our normal social connections. And so I think that it is normal and to be expected that our students and our adults and our teachers and our staffs going back to school are going to be experiencing stress, distress, emotional impact of the past year. And I would suggest that above and beyond adverse trauma and childhood experiences, the stress that most of us are feeling and reconciling and wrestling with as we go back to school and go back to work is a normal response to a very, very challenging set of circumstances. So as we go back to school and we think about problems in school, I mean, I look at violence and the potential for school violence as certainly one bad negative outcome that we want to avoid, but I also see that there may be a pathway for many of our students to other adverse outcomes that we need to be thinking about and be attuned to in terms of identifying and recognizing early signs and symptoms that then allow for us to intervene, provide prevention, provide support, provide resources. So again, I guess my thoughts are to extend the conversation and extend the thought to beyond mental illness, but look at mental wellness and look at the challenges that we've all had to face this past year and the impact that going back to an in-person environment in the workplace and in the school place is going to have for all of us.
And you mentioned some of the warning signs and what to look for. If you're a school leader, what should you be asking your teachers and school staff to look for in their, not only in their students, but in their peers, in their staff or their peers?
Well, I mean, many things. I think it depends on whether or not the teachers, for example, assuming kids are going back in the fall and we're talking about a fall entry experience, it depends on whether the teachers have an experience or a history with the students that are coming into their classroom. But clearly, one of the most obvious signs or indicators are students that are acting, behaving, looking differently than they have in the past. So they're not as engaged, their performance in school is different, they're distracted, they're not emotionally connected with their peers, with their friends, they're having trouble focusing and concentrating, and essentially they're behaving and communicating in a manner that is different from how we've seen this child previously. If you have no history with this student, then clearly one of the things we need to do when we go back to school is get to know your students, get to know your classroom. So we talked as we were preparing and pulling our thoughts together for this webinar. We talked about how we do that and how we go back into a school environment and how we sort of balance the academic challenges with the social and emotional challenges that our kids are facing. And I would argue, as a psychologist, but also as an educator, I would argue that you can't do one without the other. So your academic performance, your educational goals and objectives are not going to be realized if you've got a classroom full of students who are distracted by anxiety, what's going on at home, worry about, are they safe, are they healthy in the school environment, whatever is going on in their lives as a result of this past year, plus the baggage that they had before that. So I think priority number one in going back to school is getting to know your students and setting aside times and forums and parameters for being able to talk and understand what their emotional challenges are and what their fears are, and also to communicate. So communication is a key focus as we return to school, not only about how they're doing, but also what the school's doing to keep them safe. So I think those are all critical factors as we go back.
Yeah. And maybe, Glenn, if you could pick up on that, what about the role of district leaders in setting this tone for their staff? As a precursor to how we're interacting with students, how does that happen even before students come back into buildings? You're on mute?
You're on mute.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, Margaret mentioned an important point in terms of the impact of this on teachers and staff coming back, and how it's important for the administrators to be able to, number one, normalize that experience to the point where they're letting their faculty and staff know that these types of stresses they're experiencing are very typical response as a result of what's happening during the pandemic, and then explain some of the examples of those responses, which would include anxiety, depression, frustration in the classroom, and to provide them with a venue by which they can talk about their experiences that are happening, not only during the pandemic, but what's happening in the beginning of the school year, how they're interacting with students, how they are implementing social emotional learning strategies, and how they're engaging in self-care. What are they doing to take care of themselves? And one other thought, too, is in training teachers to become what we refer to as gatekeepers. And the gatekeeper is someone who can effectively identify a student in psychological distress. And Margaret mentioned many of the symptoms or signs of psychological distress. So to identify them and to be able to set up a trusting and a safe environment in which to talk to the student feels comfortable enough to be able to open up and share with the teacher what's going on, and then, if necessary, to make a referral to support services. And so if teachers are trained, number one, to take care of themselves, self-care, to be able to have a dialogue between themselves, and then to be able to identify students and talk to them.
I think if I can add to that, I think administrators, which I assume is the predominance of our audience today, but I think administrators and district directors and principals, assistant principals have a responsibility to set the tone for the issues that we're talking about. So administrators set a tone for a safe and caring school culture. And they do that in a number of ways, but one way is by setting forth expectations for all of their staff and all of the school community stakeholders in terms of what their individual roles and responsibilities are and what the administrators' expectations are for them relative to a safe and caring school environment. So a safe and caring school environment is modeled by the administrator and by the staff members who demonstrate compassion and compassion and caring and interest in their students. But it's also done in programmatic ways, like ensuring that your schools have a mechanism for and encourage reporting of concerning behavior and communications to the right places in your school. And that once information is reported, concerns are reported, that there is a process in place to assess those concerns and identify what kind of support and intervention may be appropriate for the student and to put that in place. So it's structural, it happens on many layers, it requires a behavioral threat assessment capacity or capability within the school, but it's also as simple as the administrator setting the tone, managing expectations, clarifying expectations, and demonstrating and modeling the behaviors that we want to see, carried out by everybody in the school community.
Fantastic. I couldn't agree more. And I hope that administrators are really hearing this message. I know that, as we've mentioned, there's a lot of concern about unfinished learning and learning loss. But as you point out, there is no learning that's going to happen if students come to school stressed and distressed, and if teachers and staff come to school not ready to focus on the learning and on the emotional needs of their students. I think there's a lot of panic out there. I would like you each to talk a little bit about the resources that are that you're making available to our attendees. Dr. Coggins, can we start with you? You sent over a couple things for us to share with folks.
I did. One was an article that I wrote actually two years ago around back to school time, and it was really an article intended for parents as they get ready to think about the new school year. But the article is 10 different issues or questions that really identify whether or not your school is prepared for prevention of targeted violence. So I think those 10 questions and 10 issues are very on point and relevant for school administrators as we think about how we should be setting up safe and caring school cultures. In that article, I talk a lot about the notion that what we're learning from the research that has now been building in terms of a pretty good body of research over the past 20+ years is that The data suggests, the data show that prevention is very, very possible. Prevention of adverse outcomes, prevention of school violence is very, very possible if we have the right processes and protective factors in place. One of those is behavioral threat assessment capabilities in the schools, which I just alluded to. I talk about that in my little article. So that article, again, gives you an overview of some of the key factors that I think are crucial and relevant to preventing school violence, but also preventing other bad outcomes like mental health issues, depression, aggression, bullying, social isolation that our kids have. So we know that there's a pathway to violence. We've learned that from the research and from the data. You all may or may not be familiar with that, but that pathway doesn't only end up in school violence. That pathway can lead to a variety of adverse outcomes like those that I just mentioned. So that's why it's so critically important that as educators and administrators, we're very attuned to what the early stage upstream indicators, warning signs, cues, and clues are so that we can avert and prevent. So that's one article. And then the other is actually a list of resources. There are a handful of reports, research reports, and operational findings and implications that have been published by the United States Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center. They have been one of the leading research entities and thought leaders in the field of school safety and prevention of targeted violence, generally speaking. I've included those references that focus on schools, as well as a couple of additional articles and references, and some information on how to get started in terms of building a behavioral threat assessment capability in your school district. So happy to talk more individually if anybody has any follow-up questions, but that's a teaser for what you're going to get after this is over.
Thank you. And I have to say, this pandemic year has been a respite from school violence because kids haven't been in school. So it would be a wonderful thing if we could return to school and have those schools be safe and supportive and caring environments that were preventative. And Glenn, I think you also have shared a couple of resources. Do you want to talk about those?
Sure. I think one of the first steps is to, pardon me for walking away from my computer, but I'm getting some feedback, and I think if I walk away, there's less of it. Okay. So one of the things is to swim way upstream and start with actually training parents in how to prevent ACEs. That is to provide them with resources by which they can manage a child's misbehaviors, a child usually 2 to 5 years of age, using evidence-based strategies that allow them to learn how to manage their children without traumatizing them. Thus, when these children start entering preschool, they're armed with the social emotional type of learning that's matched to their age, and they can start thriving from preschool on. There's also resources, and Jennifer, you can speak to these better than I can, in which we can provide trauma-informed teaching simulations, in addition to simulations that support LGBT students. And then there's also, being able to teach students how to really support themselves, how to identify a fellow student who's in psychological distress, how to talk to them and manage that conversation, and then make an effective referral. And there's a number of other resources that we have. And Jennifer, again, you can speak to them much better than I can.
I do want to highlight the op-ed that was a recent placement in the 74 by Dr. Albright that talks about 4 ways to include mental health in reopening plans. That speaks directly to this, and you can see a little excerpt on the screen. If you go to the 74 and type in Albright, I think it will come right up, and maybe that's something that Scott is going to provide in the thank you email that he's going to send. We are exactly at 2:30. So I think we won't take questions. If you do have questions or you would like to get in contact with Dr. Coggins or Dr. Albright, you can you can email me. My email is on the screen. I'm Jennifer@cognito.com, and I will filter those along to our panelists. And I just want to say thank you to Dr. Albright and Dr. Coggins and to everybody on the call today. I know that you are essential workers and heroes, and you're keeping the lights on in education in this country. And I thank you, and I wish you well and a great summer and a school year that looks a little more normal in the coming year. Please call on us if we can help you from the Cognito side. I am also happy to send you demos of our programs, and you can see how that fits with your intentions for preparing educators and students to go back to school. So I am going to thank you, Scott, there in the background, the Wizard of Oz, helping us produce this today. And we're going to call it. So thank you all very much.
Thank you for joining.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.